Okay, it works. The microphone. Good morning. Welcome also from my side. I'm Mirko. I'll be the host in this session. So we're here in the parallel session in the first part. So for those who wanted to go to second and third, this is the wrong room. We're in the first one, just to make sure. So we look at the open research data and what is needed to make this a reality, basically. What is the role of infrastructures? And we look at it from a theoretical, practical, political, and also from a research perspective. And we'll do the next 90 minutes in the following way. We'll first have 3 short 10 minutes input by the panelists. So I will call them one by one on stage. They have approximately 10 minutes. Don't be hard on them if they take a bit longer. And then afterwards, maybe if there are some technical questions, we can take them immediately. But I would like you to keep the more general reflection then for the second part. So after about 30 minutes, they will be all there with us. With me, I'll start with asking them questions, getting the panel to run, hopefully find some contradictions and heat it up a bit. And then I'll open up for you, and I hope you will also have some questions. Is that fine for everybody else? Raise your hand, or you know the biblical sentence. Okay, good, then let's start. I would like to first call Oksana Riba on stage. So she works at the Swiss Data Science Center, an initiative of EPFL and ETH long time ago, I think, now established. And you are the head of the Open Research Data Engagement and Services team, and you'll tell us everything about this and what this means. Thank you, Oksana.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk to a topic which is very close to my heart, the research data infrastructures and the open research data. And I'd like to start by sharing a bit of personal touch. I think many of us here have had the moment, excitement, when we read a research paper. It describes high quality data, and we have this desire of testing a couple of ideas that we have about that data. And luckily enough, the data is shared openly and maybe even standardized and annotated. So we go to this web link, we get to the resource with the data just to get drowned in the instructions of how to get it and what are the right procedures and so on. Let's say we have enough passion and perseverance, and we actually manage to figure out how to get that data. And then very, very frequent scenarios these days when we get more and more data and unusual types of data and data no one ever generated before, we end up having terabytes of data that we need to download, even though we may be able to test our ideas just with a little part of it. So let's say we persevere, we take this data, we start loading it to our server. It would probably fail because of server response, connection, anything else. And at the end, at the last moment, let's say we're lucky, we have this massive amount of data inside, it would still require a lot of effort to actually find the right chunk to test our idea. And it's not very sustainable to load tons of data somewhere if we just need a little piece. And that's, for me, the reason of why at the Swiss Data Science Center, we have created the unit that now I lead, the Open Research Data Engagement and Services unit. It's about making access to amazing data sets and amazing resources easy, effortless, as much as it's possible. And the key for me in making that possible are you, the representatives of research communities, people serving research communities, and people connected to, in some way or the other, to research communities. On one hand, today we have Christophe Decimo, who will talk maybe not, about amazing big research infrastructure. So RDIs such as SwissProt or REA or other tools that are available in the biomedical sector. And these are great, big, mature research data infrastructures. Now, whenever we talk big, whether it's organization, research data infrastructure, or human, as we age, we start getting slow. Or whatever we are as an entity, right? Like we get slower and slower in reacting and adapting to the new reality. And that's where we want to reconcile and have this community-driven approach at SDSC and support communities in all the ways we can, so we can grow new approaches rapidly. So this is about brainstorming together and prototyping very quickly research data infrastructures for types of data that never existed before. And again, if it's small, if it's young, if it's never existed, if it's nascent, we are much faster to check, to try, to figure out how to do it, and why it has to come from communities, because communities are the ones who essentially generate value out of data and out of code. So this brings me to the ways we do it at Swiss Data Science Center. So we help maturing any research assets into an RDI. And sometimes it starts very early. So it starts with, for example, big data set, which is not very well organized. And big data set doesn't mean good data set, because if it's not very well organized, if it's not very digestible, well, it will have very limited value. Same for the code. I guess many of you have had chances of working with a very long code that will get hard to debug. So same here. At that level, it's about introducing fair data governance practices, about introducing best coding practices, and actually maturing these assets into something that is standardized and that is findable. And it doesn't stop there. From that moment, we want to give it a shape in such a way that we can have building blocks that connect to form a research data infrastructure, or to connect to other research data infrastructure. So the idea there to have this thriving ecosystem of interconnected services, interconnected data, as soon as we can, because that would actually help getting access to the right data at the right moment with the right tool stack. And the way we do it is, as I said, like one way of brainstorming. And I'm taking an opportunity to mention that we have an ORD hackathon coming soon, 24-25 of October, that we organize with Open Science here at EPFL. And that's about trying out how RDIs could help getting the data, and also probing how new research data infrastructures, RDIs, could look like. So that's about brainstorming. But then what if we find a great idea? What if we find a new way of serving certain data or consuming certain data? Then we have another way. So we want to sustain and help sustain the approaches that make sense. And that we do through the ORD call for proposals that we started this year to really help find these potential assets, future RDIs, or already RDIs at certain level maturation, and connect them to other components, and maybe even make them crosstalk to big mature RDIs, such as the ones of SIB that I mentioned before. So with this, I'm happy to welcome you here again, and I'm looking forward to great discussion about research data infrastructures and open research data that we'll have in a while.
Thank you, Oksana. It was less than 10 minutes. You had a lot of time. Applause, exactly. Maybe stay a second so we ask a question.
Yeah.
Is there any immediate technical question or something you want to ask now? Not? I have one, actually. I want to ask you, of course, we'll talk about this also in the afternoon session, the role of AI, etc. But when you talk about cleaning codes, right? To what extent is also AI becoming a tool to clean codes at the SDSC?
Sorry, to what extent?
Is AI
a
tool for you at the SDSC to clean up codes or clean up big databases, you know?
Yeah. So we are all for using technologies, but we also want to have guarantees on technologies. So a lot of effort that we put, and we have we observe a lot of synergies in that regard. So we want to be using AI because we can prototype faster, much faster, but we need to do it smart, right? So we need to have a ways of, well, either expertise to understand what AI is proposing, or have a ways of helping us understand if it's valid or not. So that's actually where we look a lot into formal semantics and things like that, where we can actually validate some of the things that come out of AI. But clearly we are for it, and we think it's a vehicle that will help us actually brainstorm and prototype much faster.
Thank you. Perfect. I'll let you sit down and maybe enjoy the next session. I will come back in a minute to you. So the next guest I would like to introduce is Christophe Desimot of the famous, at least for me, Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics. But I think actually it used to be, or maybe still is, the most looked up website in science in Switzerland, right? Used to be, at least. I mean, it's a decades-old website for all kind of genetic sequences and biology sequences, and it is definitely a landing platform for researchers worldwide. So in that sense, I think Christophe will tell us how it is to serve a research community from the researcher's perspective as an infrastructure that exists since a while. Merci Christophe d'être ici.
So hello everyone. So indeed, I kind of like have two hats. I mean, one as a researcher, I'm a professor at the University of Lausanne, and I in bioinformatics, where I compare genes across different genomes, identify the genes that are in common across different species. For instance, how many genes we have in common with the banana as human, and seems to be of high interest to some people. Of course, we also have kind of more, let's say, so this is a bit of a general question, but we have also some more applied questions. So this is my researcher's hat, and then I also I'm leading the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics, and I was asked to provide kind of a researcher's perspective. So if I just think about the role as a researcher and where does ORD concerns me or concerns us, I think there's two main interactions. One is sometimes as a researcher I generate some data or some knowledge that actually could be useful not only for my research but for others. Of course, for collaborators, that's kind of obvious, and I might share this data directly. But very importantly, we see more and more cases where it may be others that are not even in contact with me who may be able to use this data. And so the step of sharing this data is really crucial and is at the heart of the problem we are dealing with. And I'll come back to that. And of course, as a researcher, I also want to use publicly available data. I want to be able to integrate this data maybe with some other data sets to maybe make some new discoveries or improve some of the algorithm that we develop. So you have these two aspects. And so maybe the easier one to grasp and the one that I think is less relevant for today's meeting is how to kind of take advantage of the existing data sources. I think most researchers are motivated to do so and have found ways. And when some, as Oksana was mentioning earlier, like exciting data sets are being made available, you kind of usually find a way to get at least hold of this. In some cases, maybe some scientific domain that may be a bit less, let's say, quantitative. They may, in some cases, need a little bit of help with that. But I think that part does not require quite as much efforts in terms of, like, let's say, this institutional and community efforts thinking how to foster open science. The difficult part, and I think the one that is concerning us here is how do we facilitate the deposition of the data and the knowledge for others then to benefit. And so that touches on so many different aspects. And this is really, I mean, in a way, the infrastructure is what should facilitate. So we heard just before from Oksana that, you may have some infrastructure that helps researcher kind of democratize their data, thinking about what sort of format might be appropriate, where to deposit this data. But ultimately, I think in this sharing effort, what is really important is to think who owns this data and who has the responsibility of kind of like making this data broadly useful and foster reuse. And I think as a researcher now, really very pragmatically, it's helpful to think about dividing data into two categories. The data for which there's already very well established resources or let's say deposition databases, repositories, and for which maybe even hopefully in the community, there's a certain expectation that this data be shared because it's not such a big effort. And then as a researcher, I think I will agree, and I will have certainly some motivation to deposit this data because it doesn't require much of an effort, but this is going to be useful to others. And also importantly, I know there's a resource that is going to take care of this data and make sure that it kind of is well curated, that is linked, that is reliable, that other people can also access this data. So that's relative for the standard data is relatively straightforward. I mean, the little caveat is that it may not always as a researcher be on the top of my priority list. So I kind of sometimes may need to be reminded by the funder or the journal that, well, you've generated like sequencing data, you really need to deposit this. But I think, let's say collectively, if we think about, the research enterprise, is not so difficult to understand that we are collectively better off depositing this data. Where it's much more tricky is when you have non-standard data, or when there's not been, let's say, an establishment in the field to share this data. And again, I take data in a very broad sense. Can be from raw data to quite structured data, even models and knowledge. But in any case, if we do not have like an obvious place to deposit this data, then that's where it becomes difficult. And today, the funders and the institution are a bit ambiguous because they say, well, you have to make your data fair. And therefore, you have to make this broadly available. And I would argue you could do that, but it may require a big effort. It may, in fact, be a project on its own. So I think we have kind of, there's where we have a fork in the road. And as a researcher, we're facing a kind of a dilemma, which is, either we invest our time and effort and resources into now developing a new data, in a way, moving a little bit more towards the infrastructure role, but then that is a commitment, right? Others might start depending on this. You may start to get some users. You will need to maybe, have some documentation, etc. And that brings you a little bit away maybe from your first interest, which was like to do the research or to move to the next project. But it can be also very rewarding. In fact, when I look back at my personal path, I developed like a database during my PhD that actually then led that led then the resource to be, funded by SIB, and then I joined as a group leader later when I became faculty, etc. But the point is, as a researcher, it can also be really rewarding to create a new data resource. But it is a little bit, the analogy I want to give is a bit like getting a new puppy. You could do that from time to time, but it's going to be a big commitment. You cannot probably not do that at the end of every project. And also there's a question about the sustainability, the question about reward. I think there's another parallel session about how do we reward researchers that then generate data or share data that then enable other to make discovery. So just to recap, as a researcher, I have two possibilities. I think when I have my data, either it's standardized and then I think it is, I should deposit it. It's just like an incremental additional cost. It's a bit like doing the financial reporting on my grant. That can be a requirement. And maybe as a community or the, let's say, strategy, we will be discussing about the role of the institution and the funders, maybe also to incentivize or maybe require even like this deposition of standard data, and also to facilitate the establishment of new data resources that and community practice that will then make it kind of also a standard step for researchers then to deposit the data. Or in some occasions and some rare occasions, but where I feel strongly that, okay, this data is really useful and unique, and today there is not really a good way to share it, I may, as a researcher, decide to develop a new data and kind of like transition a little bit towards more of an infrastructure kind of role. But then we have to think also about the implication. So I already alluded a little bit at funding. I think in these, when as a researcher I decide to make this step, this is also where having support by established research infrastructure can be very helpful. Maybe SDSC can help me, identify the right format that will be appropriate, or some database or other relatively, some other technology that might facilitate the sharing. But ultimately, I believe it's not just a one-off. This is then an effort that will continue. And then there's really the question, of who is in charge and who is then really making these efforts. And so sometimes it can be a handover to research infrastructure. But at SIB, for instance, the model that we have is that these resources, I mean, and so you mentioned a few large resources we have at SIB. We have also some much smaller ones, things that are supported with just like one FTE, for instance, or sometimes even less than one full economic, full time equivalent. And there's also a life cycle. So this gets evaluated, and the model that we have is actually to keep the researcher involved in this process. They get a bit of extra support, but the infrastructure need to stay grounded in the reality of the research environment. And in fact, a good resource, a good infrastructure will also generate some new interesting research questions. So could be also really rewarding for the researcher. So I think this is the situation, the dilemma that we are facing today, where there's still some potential. It's maybe clarifying a little bit what do we expect from the researchers in terms of what depositing data means, and perhaps be a little bit less ambitious when it comes to new kinds of data that could be very onerous, and where we essentially setting the researcher for failure by just requiring that they share this data systematically. But then also for the brave people who want to, let's say, spend a bit less time making their own discoveries and a bit more time enabling others to do discoveries, we need to provide a support structure that will fund the researchers, still, I think, in a competitive manner, because let's face it, we are not having, you cannot just start funding project and never stop. It needs to be competitive. There needs to be a life cycle, but they also need to be some funding. And today, I think I can say it is, despite all the interest in open research data, it's never been harder actually to fund resources. So I get the cue. I'm going to stop for now, and then happy to.
Thanks a lot. Perfect. So again, thank you for the input. Maybe small applause for him too. We gave an applause for Sana. I like the image of the puppy. Actually, I just got 2 little baby kitten cats, and it's indeed a lifetime commitment, I realize now. But maybe compared to a database, I always tell myself they live alone, they have an own consciousness. Platform needs really somebody to take care of it, right? An animal goes on alone in the worst case.
Well, in this case, I think, it's probably a typical lifespan of a resource to, I think maybe 10, 15 years. And then some, of course, last longer. But indeed, yeah, I like also this analogy.
Any urgent technical question right away? Maybe just one. You mentioned incentives. We'll talk about it, I guess, in the panel as well. But I just wondered, for example, in the case of the SIB of genetic or DNA sequences or whatever, how much do we really miss out, in terms of people not uploading things, right? Do you have a rough estimate of this dark number?
So I do not have any numbers, and I should say SIB's strength has not historically been in like a deposition database per se. It's rather that we have some resources that then build on deposed data, though we have some now increasingly. So for instance, the one which is the Swiss pathogen surveillance platform has collected during the pandemic all of the data that all the viral sequence that were produced in Switzerland and funded, paid, through the testing of the Federal Office of Public Health. And so that was, because you could not get a reimbursement without the deposition. So there, to our knowledge, it's practically all of them. Of course, when it's a deposition database that relies on the researcher, it depends on the maturity. And what I noticed with sequence deposition is that there's also then the research community that is going to put pressure. If there's a paper that is published and it's already understood why you're supposed to deposit, let's say, these data sets, and maybe the editor somehow missed that, it would be people, complaining, writing to the editor, putting pressure. So it's a whole system, but I do not have like a specific percentage.
Perfect. Thanks a lot. Happy to see you later on the panel as well. So we come to the third input by Gilles Dubochet. You know him probably. He's the head of the Open Science, how do you call it? Open Science
It's a domain.
It's a domain here at EPFL. He's also the co-chair of the national strategy around open research data and one of the co-organizers of this event. So he has a rather a national and strategic and political view on this and has been in the field since a long time. So we look forward to have your input, 10 minutes as well. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Mirko. And yes, it's a real pleasure to be here talking about this topic, which I think is an incredibly important matter. And to introduce that, what I'd like to bring to the discussion is maybe to take a step back and reflect about this notion of an infrastructure. Infrastructures are objects that science has been relying on for a long time, but not all science has. And there is, if we think about the large, very remarkable infrastructures that we know about, there are a few that immediately come to mind. Just out of interest in the room here, can you raise your hand if you've ever been inside the cave of the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva, went actually down to visit the LHCb or the Atlas experiment? Can you raise your hand? Yeah, quite a few of you, but I don't think it's the majority, which is a pity. I think it's something that's very much worth trying to do because it is, I mean, some of you went there. What word would you use to describe the feeling when you are down there in front of these large experiments? Can someone maybe say a word? Nothing? What did you say? Awesome. Colossal, yeah. Colossal is pretty good, yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good word. I would have used awesome personally, but that's what I heard. So you see, it's like how the brain works. But what is clear is that these are machines that are efforts in terms of building something that will serve science that are absolutely gigantic. And they've had a huge influence in the development, not only of the field that they serve, and obviously the large colliders have played an essential role in the development of high energy physics. But not just that, we all know the stories that come around the CERN from the fact that, well, the culture that developed within CERN led to the idea of the World Wide Web. They invented it, whatever that means. It led to the development of technologies that have nothing to do with particle physics directly. For example, the MRI machines that are linked to the development of magnets, of superconductive magnets that are needed for the development of these machines. And so what I want to get to with this example is that a facility like the Large Hadron Collider of the CERN, the machine that we see when we go down this cave, it's obviously the most visible object, the one that everyone thinks about. But really, the value of LHC for the high energy particle community is not just that. And I would argue that a crucial aspect of what a facility or what an infrastructure like that brings is the fact that this community is able to specialize itself around certain tasks that are important in the field. We heard Jerome talk about that this morning in connection to their own project, the Open Scope project. It allows the community to think of itself as a community with a common research purpose, a common research goal. When the particle physics people together designed the requirement for the LHC and the instruments that are connected to it, they did it with a clear understanding that they were building a machine, for example, to identify the boson of Higgs. It was part of the design requirement that wasn't the single project of a single research, but was the project of a community as a whole. And this sense of scale that an infrastructure can bring within a community, it is not only the scale of the machines and the funding that can flow into building something that the community needs. It's also the scale, I would say, of the ambition that a community can have around advancing science in their field. Now, when we think about infrastructures, that's usually what we think about: facilities, big machines, expensive machines, telescopes, or the incredible network that is needed to collect meteorological data, to take the examples that we heard this morning. But really, and this is something which I think I realized myself when having left research. I'm a computer scientist by background. I worked on the Scala programming languages, for those who don't know, which is an open source software that is very influential and used in a lot of industry today. When I left research and started working in policy in Brussels, notably, where talking about infrastructure is like a pastime that everyone indulges in because that's where the big money is, and therefore everyone wants to be involved in that. I realized that, well, actually, this open source software that I worked on and which we shared with the intention for a community to pick it up, both in terms of industry partners, but also in terms of having other researchers essentially work on questions in programming language research that are around the topic that we defined with the Scala programming language. It is, in a very real way, an infrastructure that allows the community to essentially work around the same source code, the same pieces of software that are driving a common purpose in terms of what is the research that is going on. And the effect it had is huge. Now, most modern programming languages, whether it's Swift or C# or whatever, are basically have embedded the like models of Scala into their own structures, more or less. And Scala itself is training a huge number of, there are lots of practitioners trained on Scala, but also it drives a lot of production of papers. And so this notion that infrastructures have originally been thought essentially as a matter of building large facilities in a world where data, software, AI models are becoming so essential to the task of modern research. We need to be talking about what we call research data infrastructures. And here I understand data in a very broad sense. Data is actually defined explicitly in the Swiss ORD strategy as pretty much anything that isn't open access to publication. It's data in the traditional sense, it's software, it's open hardware, it's everything you want to put in there. And a research data infrastructure is essentially an effort in which a community comes together to scale up in terms of resources, but also in terms of vision, a certain way of using data and of creating value out of it. And to me, and I will conclude with that in this introduction, this is an essential contribution that a community can do to a certain type of open science. Open science is many different things. One is connected to trust. We want to be open because that way our research is reproducible and therefore trustworthy. But I think the most important part of open science is that open science is about community work, teamwork, big science, the type of large projects that a single research group cannot do alone. And I think we heard it this morning in connection to the questions that were linked to the Open Scope project. Are you actually engaging the community? Is it a common project or is it you doing something? And we see the desire and the intention there to bring a community together around the data infrastructure and actually change the way a whole community works together. Not just what resources they have, but how they think about their own role in the research project. And to me, that is what infrastructures are contributing to open science and making them a reality. So I'm really excited to talk about that with my colleagues who maybe have different views on that. I'm very excited.
Thank you, Gilles. Fantastic. Stay a second, an applause for him as well. Fairness is also part of the scientific world, not just open. Yeah, exactly. But maybe, is there a question? Maybe I have one to you, actually, just before you. Okay, you can already shift over if you want, yeah? Exactly, you need a microphone. So you use this image. We have a lot of metaphors today. We had the puppies, now you use the LHC, right? And I was wondering, maybe a bit from my background, you know, a bit in communication. So around LHC, you mentioned it, there is this, of course, this holy grail of the boson, for example. So people can hold on this voyage or this adventure, right? So around a research data infrastructure, where there might be some data which you don't have to convince me, of course, something great came already out and will even more come out. but sometimes it's more of an exploratory field. Do we sometimes lack maybe these, holy grails around which research, especially as an incentive, which goes beyond funding or mandatory journals that tell you to do, maybe want to go there and because it's part of a bigger journey? You see what I mean?
Absolutely see what you mean. And I would actually take a pretty radical position about that and say that, in my view, in a field where the way the field is structured, the way the research questions exist within that field does not allow for the emergence of some kind of coherence in the research questions that are being asked, then I don't think this field is a field that benefits from large-scale infrastructures. And there is nothing wrong with that. We've done research for a long time where certain domains had infrastructures because they needed it, and other fields didn't, because the focus in other fields was about exploration, where the breadth, if you want, of the research is more important than the depth of the research, if you want. And in that sense, I don't think that it is an optional feature in an infrastructure that is really impactful. In fact, again, to take the example of the presentation we heard this morning, where Jérôme was concluding his presentation around the notion that he wants, or they want, to bring in the community around defining common research goals. It's not surprising, because I think as long as they don't demonstrate their ability to bring the community around common research goals, they will remain essentially a service that is helpful for people who can apply for the projects there, but not a true infrastructure in the transformative sense that I described just now.
Thank you. I'll let you get over. Maybe we do a smooth transition. I'll just take it from here. So welcome again, Christophe and Oksana. Which seat do you pick now? I wonder. Stay close, exactly next to Oksana would be perfect. You have microphones here, you have water here. Maybe we stay right away. And again, I will open for the audience in 20, 30 minutes. But if you have questions, raise your hand. I'll spot you and I'll give you the mic. So staying on this incentive, as I mentioned, maybe Christophe, because you also mentioned, right, funding, journals. But again, I ask you a bit the same question. So hasn't it been easier to expect sequence data when people knew we're going to sequence the human genome 20 years ago because there was a common goal, than when it's just a mandatory last effort part, like doing a financial report, as you said? So do infrastructures also need a goal that is declared in order to bring the community in? Or is it sufficient to saying it's mandatory before you publish, or it's at the end of your financial report?
So I think for the example of the sequencing, these were like two different communities. In the 20 years ago, these were large consortia. I mean, there was a worldwide consortium of people who were indeed like, I mean, I think this is very similar to the kind of community effort that Gilles is mentioning, which, by the way, cost a lot of money. They needed to find a Nobel laureate who knew nothing about DNA, well, except for having discovered it, to go to Congress and convince the US Congress to spend $1 billion on it. And then, the race, they were under a lot of pressure. And that's kind of interesting in terms of the genesis, in terms of, I think the role of open science there. But it's I would say very much like, let's say, a big science type of effort with substantial funding, and already like a lot of people who are, let's call them like professional, like infrastructure people involved. What we are talking about with the data deposition is more like the long tail of researchers who produce data in the course of their studies. It's not their really job or vocation to share this data in the first place, or to sequence the data per se, but rather they want to use it for their research. But we ask them, please, we know you're done with your work and you've gotten like what you want out of it. Still, please deposit this, because this was funded with public money. It's not a big effort, and others will be able to take advantage of it. And we see time and again, a whole ecosystem of people then building on this raw data and then integrating, all the way to scientific knowledge. So I would put these two things are very much like a very different, I think, dynamic. Now, I think where And well, maybe I could stop here. Or
Yeah, but or again, maybe I can also pass to Oksana. Again, you three, just anytime if you have something to say, maybe raise your hand. I would like to structure it a bit, but Oksana, I feel your muscles.
I can. I would like to relate to what Christoph just said. I remember having frequently myself the moments, and met many scientists who had the moments when they get this genomic sequencing data, and somehow what is in a paper, and there is an accession number, it's deposited, but some files will be missing. And why? Why they're missing? Because it is a postdoc who probably did the research, who needs to deposit this data. They are busy. They're starting a new postdoc maybe, or maybe even a lab. They have so much happening in their life, so they do their best to upload the files, but then maybe there was an error message that some of your files didn't pass. And it takes time, right? Because these are big infrastructures that are slow to move. And that's where I think for us at Swiss Data Science Center, we see this difference that what about we bring researcher a tool that makes this upload easy and maybe triggers something, or like maybe defines also ownership. The fact that what you mentioned, Christoph, if ownership is with postdoc, I don't think so, right? The ownership is probably with the lab. And can we have some way for the lab to facilitate a bit this process? And for me, this kind of like facilitation roles now in the world of technologies that we have, that's where I see growing into the ways of having RDI maybe building blocks.
Mm-hmm. I see your point, but again, if what is again the dark number here? Because again, I've been a PhD. I told you before. I had some data. I was never contacted by SIB, even was part of it. I wasn't obliged by any journal to. So you can't. You say, how do you go actively towards research? How do you advertise the SDSC? You know what I mean? So I see you facilitate, but how do we? Maybe because we're already into strategies for a country. You know, how do we make sure that this is part of the life cycle, like a financial report? Yep, Christoph, and then
So
go ahead.
I mean, I would challenge the notion that all data should be deposited. Maybe it's a good thing that you didn't have to spend more time like uploading some data to a place that, you know, would not have led really to others building their research on this data. Because in a way, I mean, the same way, you know, building your research project based on previous results, previous papers, is an act of faith. And then, you know, you have to be careful, because if it's unreliable, you might be wasting a lot of time. Building your work on some data is also potentially frauds, and it will take some time. And so we now a little bit, you know, we've gotten very excited about the prospect of sharing data. And I think, you know, there's this notion that everything should be shared. Well, frankly, you know, there's also a problem, I think. I mean, it's just not sustainable time-wise and cost-wise to share everything. And we need to have an incentive structure and some system such that the most valuable data get shared, the things that are easy to do and that will, you know, have a good prospect of being reused. That should be focused. But in a way, I disagree with your premise that, yeah, all the data should be shared, and perhaps you should not feel guilty about sitting on data.
Gilles, but you mentioned exact definition. Everything is kind of data, right? So how do you differentiate what data goes in and what not?
Yeah, and I actually very much agree with Christoph. It's really important to have this conversation about the fact that it's not because we promote open data that it means every single piece of data should be on a repository. And there are two reasons for that. One is that it's unmanageable. And the second is that, I mean, at some point when the ratio of garbage data over actually useful data becomes at a certain level, the whole set has no more value at all. And so we need to talk about quality, we need to talk about purpose. But I think there are fundamentally two good reasons, or two reasons why data should be open. And these are not, in my view, fundamentally negotiable. One is that we as a scientific enterprise are telling the world essentially that we have this beautiful model of creating knowledge that is called the scientific model, and that works because every result we produce can be reproduced by another researcher who can prove that it is false possibly, and therefore guarantees that the whole system stays up as a creator of knowledge. And without making the data and the software and the models available alongside the research, we are basically not delivering this promise. And so I think that is one of the arguments, or one of the times, and it's a very important one, where data needs to be open. It is in connection to the ability to reproduce a piece of research. And I think there, the matter that Christophe was mentioning, that it has to be done in a smart way. It's not about just dumping every data you may have alongside the project, but actually putting out a data set or software or model, whatever, that is useful as, if you want, a proof of the work you've done and of the ability to reproduce it. So that requires thinking more than just dumping data on a platform. And people, researchers, I think, need to be supported in doing that. The second reason you want to open data is when, and I'm coming back to what I'm saying before, when there is a scientific project that relies on data being available. And I think Christophe, again, knows that very well. The whole first genomics and increasingly the broader omics field has seen that making this data available broadly turns out to be an incredibly powerful tool to do science. And just having these large databases of omics data is transformative in terms of the science that has been done. And so there is a real reason to put data out, because there is a scientific purpose for it. And I think with these two reasons, we basically cover the scope of what I would consider needs to be open data under this principle, which is written in the ORD strategy of as open as possible. And in my view, possible should be understood as basically these two reasons, and as closed as necessary. I don't think that is part of the discussion today, but just as a reminder, it is also part of the strategy.
Thank you. Yeah, so you mentioned, I mean, again, for those who have never seen me on stage, I like to be a bit the devil's advocate, because they're all like unisono advocating for open science. I'm actually too behind the scenes, but here I'm advocating a bit against to make it more spicy. So if you take this literally what you say, Gilles, the Popper falsifiability criterion, right? Basically, all science stands on this, not only certain science. So we still haven't found a solution why certain data should not be in, right? And so, yeah, you see what I mean? So I still don't see the criterion to say what should go in or not. The purpose you mentioned, what's exactly? So let's take the example of meteorology data, right? We know now Google is the last years working on this next holy grail, trying to beat all the meteors. I think they launched it recently, the first version. They can predict the weather 4 or 5 days ahead, not only 2 or 3 days with more accuracy. This is based on lots of data that they realize is everywhere. Some of the data is not even by scientists. When we even touch the citizen science project here, they realize that even sensors at home of people are useful. So what they do for years is aggregating all kinds of data, gathering people around a purpose, as you mentioned, Gilles. So when there is no purpose, how can people come around? I know I've asked this question again, but I want to ask it again, a bit more elaborated. How do we know what data is useful or not?
Can I add a spice?
Yes, please.
To that spice?
Please, spice, yes. They don't need.
I'm thinking about this amazing project we have here at EPFL campus, the quatre, so the automated lab for chemistry of catalysis. Mm-hmm. And the vision there is, can we generate the data that we humans don't understand yet exactly what's the purpose, so that machines and AI and amazing algorithms can understand? So that would create actually this challenge to this question: how do you decide which data is actually useful as a human, which may have limited vision of what is coming up with the new technologies? I couldn't resist the temptation to ask that exact question. So Gilles, if you have an answer, I'm very...
I mean, well, I'm going to first start with a little bit of a cop-out by saying that I think the point is that there is not a single answer. It's a question that every community has to work out for itself. But I think there are still some guidelines that can be given. One is that not all data has the same value. And there is some data, for example, say, taking traditional light microscopy pictures of a commonly available organism. That can be reproduced in most labs. So the data there, well, I mean, fine if it's available, but it's not super valuable. And in fact, arguably, if you want to reproduce the research, you probably want to start from scratch anyway. On the other opposite of the spectrum, there is data that is basically invaluable. whether it's just incredibly expensive to produce, that comes out of, and we're coming back to that, from large-scale facilities or infrastructures, or that simply does not exist anymore. Say, for example, a picture of a supernova, well, that supernova is no longer there the next time you want to look at it. And so that data is essentially invaluable. And I think that is one part of the answer, is that the value of the data has to be part of the equation. But I would say the other part is, and that's where the community aspect comes in, is how you actually build trust within a community around reproducibility, since that's what we are talking about now, and I hope we will talk about infrastructures more later. But the fact is that in some communities, you want to have the data as the proof that the research is done well. In other communities, the data is essentially just part of the process, but you want to start from scratch if you are reproducing something. And that, again, is something that I think needs to be taken into account to decide what data, but also importantly, in what form should be made available. For example, and I'll finish with that, we see now a lot of push around not just releasing data, but actually in a computational form, so that you can actually run it and do something with it. And I think this is a hugely important development, because it shows that there is some real thinking taking place in terms of not just releasing a data set and say, well, do something with it, I don't care, but actually making an effort into thinking about what the value of that data is by doing the work of making it computational. We've seen an example this morning, but there's lots of that around. And I think that's another part of the answer here.
Thank you. Maybe and then we go to infrastructures. You're absolutely right.
Well, so my answer to the question, what data should be shared, I mean, is one that I think it should be best sent back to the researchers. I mean, the problem is that researchers don't like to be told what they should be doing and how they should be setting their priorities. In fact, they are constantly juggling, among like lots of different activities, and they constantly have to think, what is it that I'm doing that may have like the great impact, the trade-off between teaching and doing research and mentoring, etc. And so if we say, well, no, this is really something that you have to do, I mean, it can work to some extent. It's going to be at a really great pain. You will, I mean, we have good example. I do believe sometimes we just need actually to have a bit of peer pressure and, force ourselves to be our better selves. But what works really is the incentives. And actually, I think many researchers also realize the data can have a very big impact on the scientific discovery. And I think if we, foster this type of, recognition, and we help those actually who are really motivated to sit on data because they believe in it, and we focus our attention there, I think we're already going to see that there's a lot more potential. And I think also the funders, they think sometimes of this infrastructure part as something that is, it's like a cost and it's like a burden. And they think, well, we want to put all our money in bottom-up science and not on the infrastructure part, which is kind of like overheads, And I think this is wrong. I mean, of course, if you put all the resources in the infrastructure and not in the bottom-up research, then you also have a problem. You end up, having something that is really stale. But at the moment, the momentum is very much on like one-off novelty. You do some project just for a few years, you publish, and then you can just move on. And if we find some ways to, reward occasionally like impactful data sharing, I think researchers will do that, and they will naturally like trade this activity off with the other type of activities that they have to do.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, Gilles, you mentioned it. Let's move to infrastructures that then hold this data. Oksana?
Yeah, I actually have a link to infrastructure from what Christophe and Gilles just said. For me, one of the ways we can actually figure out which data should be shared is thanks to infrastructure. And actually, an example in genomics, again, comes to my mind. That's where we can have a DNA readouts, so the chunks of the sequences, and we can have a reference genome, right? Aligned to this reference genome and formatted in a certain way, so we can actually reconstruct the raw data, so we can store less. And we can have what we call now active layers in research data infrastructures that help us store less, but reconstruct it all. And that's where I see a strong link towards how the research data infrastructure should now evolve, so we can actually like share more with less resources in a way. And that's an exciting question. And I'm sure genomics is not the only field where we can actually go into that direction and explore the benefits of technology to facilitate data sharing.
Thank you for this comment. Infrastructure. So I want to change a bit gears here and ask more in the sense of, so if you look around, not only Switzerland, but around the world, scientific community, what are kind of, you know, the best international standards or infrastructure that you think this is kind of the holy goal? So please don't say SIB and don't say SDSC. If you take the word, Gilles, maybe then I'll give you the word first. You know, what is an example you say, wow, this is a really good way of doing the whole thing. It's a good incentive, it works well, there's no errors message, it facilitates, it brings everything together.
Yeah, so I think I want to give two examples in addition to the Scala example I already gave, which is of course a great
you can't mention your own example.
but I will not take it again. But I think one example I want to give is that we see that traditional facility infrastructures, so actual hardware, are increasingly moving to develop into data infrastructures. And an example that I saw recently and that I find still very impressive is the European Southern Observatory. So the organization that builds the very large telescopes in the Andes in South America, which are obviously infrastructures that are outrageously expensive and serve a community that basically depends on these infrastructures to function, or these facilities to function. Well, in the past 10 or 15 years, they've been developing their data infrastructure, which is basically a platform where all of the photos that are taken by the telescopes are stored. And what they are seeing now is that, depending on how they count, but between 20 and 40% of the publications that are coming out of the HES-SO system no longer use time on the telescope, but are actually driven by the database. And I think this is one very nice example of how thinking about data infrastructures as the focus point rather than the traditional facility allows to scale up the ability to do research in a way that can really be transformative. So that is one example I think we can give as an example. And of course, it's built around the whole community of HES-SO with the specialization, the scale, also, frankly, the lobbying to obtain funding that it allows to have. Another example I would like to give, and which is maybe not really an EPFL, an example that's very close to EPFL, if you'll allow me another one of those, because I think when it comes to biology, where there's a lot to say, you will be better placed to talk about that, but is happening around linguistics. And I think there are some very interesting development in this field, which traditionally was a traditionally conservative, I would say, social science field where people were publishing their paper around some rare part of a rare language. And increasingly, we are seeing the development of computational linguistics as a key driver in the community, where the field is learning to use data-intensive approaches to exploring the characteristic of languages. And they've been developing very interesting infrastructure. In Switzerland, I think we have the project is around a project called LIRI, but that is itself part of, I'm sorry, maybe I'm confusing it, but I think the European project is called DARIA, and there's really a scale to it that allows the whole community, who at least the members in this community who are interested in these computational models, to come together and actually develop the capacities to do that, which is new for them. And they're doing it because they are thinking about this like common project as something that they're building. And I think that's a very nice example of how, by coming together and developing capacities, it allows the whole field to essentially integrate a novel way of thinking about what they do that profoundly transforms what they're keeping.
Very nice examples. You have one too, Christoph?
So maybe if you allow me, just to follow up on what Gilles has said. I mean, I've been thinking about this notion now that you know, like big science versus kind of small science, and so I mean, you've established research infrastructure do not need to be made out of like large concrete and hardware. I totally agree with this, but I would also argue we have also a whole spectrum in terms also of size. But indeed, I mean, one point that is really key, and you've mentioned this also repeatedly, is the notion of the community that is behind that infrastructure. If there's no community, then you ask yourself, okay, is this what is the relevancy of this infrastructure? However, the community, I think it's also interesting to see different kind of models. And so I've mentioned the Human Genome Consortium. We've heard Scala. So I'm not so familiar with this, but I know about some of the open source projects which have been extremely successful at creating some community in a way that requires actually very little formal structures around, and also famously also very little funding. I mean, given the scale of the project. Now, does it work for any kind of like, let's say, infrastructure? I'm not quite sure. I think we have to recognize that in different fields, there may be different needs and there's kind of like different scales. But yeah, I'm thinking about you know, the fact that in some areas a community may just be you know, in 50 people who can meet like every 2 years, but that will then service quite a large community of users. In some cases, a community is something that is much larger and then will require probably some sort of like a formal process, you know, to organize things at already like at the regional level. And that makes it really quite complicated because there's seemingly no one size fits all. So just maybe less of an answer than really a question, a bit broader, which is, you know, what are the kind of model that work, and do we risk, like now in, you know, in this phase where we want to foster the establishment of new infrastructure or the maintenance of existing infrastructure, focusing too much on one particular kind of model?
Thank you. Oksana, want to add something?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about SIB infrastructures?
Yes, you
no,
can.
I'm joking. I will not. Sorry, Christoph. I will be brief. So I will mention something that inspires us a lot at Swiss Data Science Center. Of course, it's Hugging Face. It's an amazing infrastructure. I don't know how many of you know about it, but that's a place where you can get Hugging Face. Already name is nice.
Face, yes.
Hugging Face, yes. The logo is cute. and that's really an inspiring infrastructure where you can see how to connect models, data sets, spaces where you can work with these models, maybe some outcomes, playgrounds. I mean, that's so enabling. I think this is really, at least in data science and machine learning AI field, that's what's popping out in the mind. It's exciting, it's inspiring. And then I would like to make just a little comment, like what Krista was also saying, that there is also a gradient, like what is the community size? How much cost can they bear to have their infrastructure? And there are actually amazing examples of very low cost infrastructure, something anchored on GitHub as a central phase to some resources that could be called, can also point to data, and some people even store data on GitHub. I will not comment if it's a good idea, but for some communities, that would be good and sufficient infrastructures. And as a final note, I guess for me personally, a good infrastructure is when we can reuse pieces of it. I don't know, EBI, for example, has amazing pieces of open source infrastructure where we can take a piece and just repurpose and use it for something else. It's there, ready to use, maintained by a big organization, but available to a smaller one. And that's where I think it depends how we would define what means for us a good research infrastructure. Yeah.
Thank you, Christoph. Yeah,
So Hugging Face, isn't it backed by a company?
I was just about to go there. Please do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. Who
but
belongs?
that doesn't
Which
make
company?
it less good example.
No, but I think this is just to show again, the diversity of model that might work. I mean, well, GitHub is also, backed by Microsoft.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, we see some are intergovernmental organization, some are completely like self-organized, operation run by, let's say, a benevolent dictator within the community. Others may be backed by some companies. So this is also, I think, what makes it so challenging. I mean, which model really work?
Yeah.
I'm happy to I think react to that, and maybe to some degree perhaps contradict also my fellow
Spice.
speakers. Finally, yeah. Yeah. Because I think scale matters when we talk about infrastructures. And I know it's an uncomfortable reality, but there are several reasons why scale is, in my view, something important. The first is that there is just so much available, I would say, attention from funders, policymakers, institutions around infrastructures. And when every researcher is telling them, I have an infrastructure, my infrastructure, I need to move forward, what it means as a result is that there is no actual push towards making these type of infrastructures feasible. I mean, if you think about the open scope project we heard about this morning, I think I read on Wikipedia that they received $300 million from a foundation to develop that. I mean, I don't know if Jérôme is in the room and can correct that, but I don't see him. So it's like at some point, money and the ability to invest into a project matters to bring it to a certain size. But scale is not just a question of money, because there are some projects in terms of research data infrastructures that are actually cheap. And running, say, a platform to host data for a community that isn't like very large scale data, today it's not an expensive proposition. It's something that is very achievable even with limited funds. But the matter of scale still is important, because it's not so much the funding amount, but the size of the community that is impacted. And that is another aspect of scale that is crucial in my view when talking about infrastructures. Not necessarily in terms of number of researchers, but in terms of the proportion of a certain domain. And if the field is like 50 people, but all 50 people are involved, then it's still quite at a large scale. Now, the other reason why scale is important is that I think we heard it this morning again. I'm referring a lot to Jérôme's presentation, because I think it was it showed a lot of the dynamics that are happening there. But at the end, the discussion about, well, what is their relation as infrastructure owners towards the community? Like, what do they own the community and what do they expect back from the community? I don't know if you noticed, but at the end, there was this question that someone asked around what's in it for you. And I think, maybe I'm wrong, maybe you understood it differently, but I understood the question to mean what's in it for you, Jérôme, and your team doing the work. And he answered in terms of what's in it for the researchers that we are trying to bring into our project, which I thought was very interesting, because I think it shows that to be the owner or the leader of an infrastructure project, you basically have to turn your position vis-a-vis the community on its head and start thinking about the commons, the community as a team project, rather than your own role in it. And that's a big choice to make. It's an expensive proposition. When a professor says, I have this great open data set, I'm going to put it on a platform and I'm going to do open science, there's going to be everyone who uses it. Nah, in most cases, it doesn't deliver much value, because there isn't this intention to engage the community. And that only really makes sense if there is a certain scale to it, or at least if there is the expectation that it can scale up to a certain size that actually makes it worth to make this huge sacrifice to say, I'm now thinking about the us rather than the me, but I'm expecting that as a result, I will be at the center of something that will have potentially a transformative impact on science. And that's, in my view, the key point where we go from research data, open research software into an infrastructure.
Thank you. Customer is king. Before I give you the word, Christophe, maybe just prepare your questions. After Christophe, I would like to take questions from the audience. Yeah, Christophe?
So you won't be surprised that I disagree. So, I mean, there's no question that very large infrastructure have proven, generated a lot of value. And so I'm not putting this in opposition. But I do think that the better metric is kind of the return on investment. It's kind of in a long-term perspective, or you could say the impact that you get for the franc invested. And so if you have a small operation that has actually, affects a large community, not as large as maybe as a let's say big science, it may still be like a better value for their scientific community to support. And so, of course, the thing that is scary for the funder or for the institution is that, well, there may be a lot of people who will claim that they have an infrastructure, and how are you going to spend all time reviewing this? And so these are practical considerations that will need to be addressed. But nevertheless, sometimes you have, and I would argue almost all the resources that I know start small first, and then they show that they are valuable, and then they get bigger and bigger. The first accelerator has a certain size, and then you ask for something that is bigger, etc. And so, if you go straight to the large thing and say, okay, our focus is going to be solely on the big science, I think we miss out on a lot of actually the infrastructure of tomorrow. And the last point I want to make on this is that we should not underestimate how difficult it is for some of these small infrastructure just to sustain. Sometimes just like one FTE may be very difficult for places that do not have funding for this type of role. And we see very regularly very good resources that have to close shop, and is very harming, actually is harming the open research data efforts. Would be very good value for the money to support, but it's just like, okay, it doesn't pass above a certain threshold where you would get enough visibility for people to realize. Yeah.
Okay, we have a discussion going